Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining Lake Bluff Library today to hear our speaker, David Clark, talking about digging deeper into the Chicago architecture. Before Dave gets started, I wanted to tell you that we do have a program next Thursday afternoon at 2:30 in the afternoon, the same time, and it's by Bill the Baker. So if you have any interest in learning how to make scones, he has a basic recipe, and then he will talk about ways you can adapt that recipe. So, okay, Dave is a historian, a local historian who has several programs that he presents. So today he's doing Digging Deeper. So let's welcome Dave and get started. Thank you.
Hello and welcome. Thanks for inviting me over to your library virtually today. And my name is Dave Clark, and I have written a few books about local history, usually about transportation, but I also am a fanboy of architecture. And I've been taking deep dives into the history of the Chicago area for several decades now. And today we're going to dig deeper into the foundations of Chicago architecture. Now, Chicago's stunning skyline and its iconic skyscrapers are world famous, but our collection of landmark buildings have been designed by a succession of architects and engineers over the years, over the course of generations even. But it doesn't take a famous architect or a talented engineer to tell you that before you can build up to the highest heights, well, you have to dig deep. So today we're going to dig deep to explore the foundations of Chicago architecture. Now, geologically speaking, Chicago was not a naturally ideal spot to build a metropolis. The site would pose many obstacles to builders, at first even for the most rudimentary of structures. Architects and engineers would have to use everything they learned, and then through inspiration, trial and error, and failure, and eventually they'd find success with new methods and technologies. And this map of Chicago first appeared in the Chicago Tribune in 1933. And that was the centennial of Chicago's incorporation as a town back in 1833. It's one of my favorite maps of early frontier Chicago with lots of marvelous detail. Here on the upper left, for instance, we find this very useful notation that much of the Chicago area was indeed swampland. One of the facts that led to such difficulty in building a city here. And I'm going to turn the map so it is oriented in a more familiar way with north at the top. And on the right here is Fort Dearborn, the first official governmental structure built here. This is how it looked when rebuilt in 1816 after the War of 1812. And it was located on the closest thing the city site had anything resembling high ground. Now, after 4 years as a town, Chicago got a new charter to be a city in 1837. And the first city mayor was William Ogden. He brought this gentleman. His name was John Van Osdel. He brought him to town because Ogden wanted a new home and thought he'd bring in a professional architect to do it. He had met Van Osdel back in New York, where they both were from. And so Van Osdel would have remained in the city for decades, and he would be our first professional architect. Now, 50 years later, he'd write down his memoirs of those early days when he first got here and how Chicago was when he first encountered it. And he noted in one of his journals that the main problems with the fact that the Chicago city site was what we would now call a wetland. Fort Dearborn and Michigan Avenue south of the river were on the highest ground, but only about 10 feet above the water level. And Van Osdel wrote that the surface drainage was from Michigan Avenue to the river, and from State Street west was nearly a level plain, elevated some 2 to 3 feet above the river. The surface water, he wrote, cut large gullies in the soil known as sloughs. 3 of these sloughs opened into the main river. One was at State Street, and it was about 60 feet at the mouth, extended in a southwesterly direction to what is now the corner of Dearborn and Lake. Another had its outlet between Clark and the South Street and extended across Lake Street. And the third, most formidable, was on the north side near Franklin Street, being 180 feet wide at the river and extending north through the Kingsbury and Newbury to Chicago Avenue. Now, I've superimposed the locations of these 3 sloughs on a Google map of the current downtown area so you can see the extent of them and how really troublesome they must have been to trying to build a city here. And here's how they look on a satellite map of the area today. I have them flashed in there for you to see. I want to focus on the North Slough, the one that Van Asselt considered the most formidable. And I'm going to give you a perspective view and put the buildings that we would see there now, put them on top of that. And so if the slough was still there, you can see from this, we would not have that merchandise mart. And that's that iconic building that was the largest office building in terms of interior space when it was built. Now, Van Asselt noted of that North Slough in 1838, the depth of the water in the slough was sufficient to float a scow. Now, I had to look it up because I didn't know. A scow is a flat-bottomed boat used to haul cargo. So clearly, a high water table and surface moisture was problematic indeed for building anything substantial. Something had to be done, or today we'd be sailing up Merchandise Mart Creek without a paddle. A different kind of sail at the mart. Now, as Chicago grew in its first decades, the structures were mainly wood, most of balloon frame construction. Wood sidewalks were built in many parts of the city, but the streets just remained dirt, and therefore mainly mud. There's a story told, a pedestrian walking one day on one of the sidewalks, when he saw a man struggling in the street. The poor guy had sunk down into the muddy street to the point that all that stuck out was the tops of his shoulders, his head, and his hat. He had sunk all the way down. So the pedestrian yelled out to the guy, "Sir, are you okay? Do you need some help?" And the man was one of those frontier spirits, and he said, "No, I'm fine, just fine. But the horse I'm on, he's not doing so well." So anyway, something had to be done about that. So in 1856, the city council passed an ordinance designed to improve drainage as well as help with wastewater disposal. So a sewer system was installed for the first time by laying a sewer pipe on the existing street grade and then placing a new road bed above the pipes. It was then up to the property owners to either fill in around their buildings, that would make their old second story the new ground level, and then their old first floor was now their basement. Or they could employ one of several enterprising engineers to raise their buildings to the new grade level. Here's an ad from one of those engineers that was in the business of raising businesses and raising buildings. His name was James Hollingsworth, and this ran in the Chicago Tribune. So Mr. Hollingsworth was responsible for raising the Briggs House at the northeast corner of Wells and Randolph Streets. And so the method here was to have all these workmen with jack screws, and they would excavate a little bit underneath the building, put the jack screws in place, and then turn them in succession, a little at a time, so they would be raising the building very evenly all around the building, and do it while there were still people in the building. If you had an office in this building, and you went in the morning, you come out to stair steps that weren't there when you went in because you had to walk down to the grade level. And 6 engineers, including Hollingsworth and a young man whose name you might recognize, George Pullman, worked together in 1860 to lift an entire half block of buildings on Lake Street east of Wells all at once. This was a row of shops, 320 feet long, of brick and stone 4- and 5-story high buildings, nearly an acre of space, estimated to weigh 35,000 tons. Businesses operated normally over the 5 days it took. There were 600 men using 6,000 jack screws, who then built new foundation walls underneath. According to newspaper reports, the spectacle drew crowds of thousands who were on the final day permitted to walk at the old ground level among the jacks. Now, in October of 1871, the Great Chicago Fire devastated the city, killed 300 people, destroyed nearly all structures in an area that it was over 3 square miles. And the aftermath, the city had to dig out and rebuild. And that fire created a lot of debris and rubble that had to be dealt with. So now, prior to the fire, this is what the downtown lakefront looked like. There was this lagoon at the shore. And there was a breakwater in the distance there with the Illinois Central Railroad running along the breakwater. This view here, if you can imagine, if you've ever been at the Art Institute of Chicago. So this would be the view looking east there, just slightly to the northeast. So there would be this lagoon right in front of you where the Art Institute stands right now. Beyond that, railroad tracks, and then the structures you see in the distance are grain elevators right next to the river. And to the left, that archway is the way the railroads got to the river harbor in order to receive cargo. So, so what they did with the Chicago fire was they filled in this lagoon. The fire debris was just dumped right into that. So the debris was covered over with dirt and grass to create the first strip of Lakefront Park, originally known as Lake Park, later renamed Grant Park. So here is the post-fire view looking south towards the Illinois Central train station at 12th Street, which is now Roosevelt Road. And to give you an idea where this was, the museum campus would be just to the left of those tall buildings in the distance. So that's, there are now some condos called Illinois Center, excuse me, Central Station, that stand where the old Illinois Central train station was there in this picture, in this postcard. Now, John Van Asselt recalled later that the fire also led to another raising of the grade. Much of the fire debris was left in place, covered over, and the street grade in the burn district was raised again. So this photo shows the post-fire conditions at State and Madison Streets. One of Van Asselt's largest pre-fire projects was designing the Palmer House Hotel at the southeast corner of State and Monroe. Its grand opening was on September 26, 1871. But there was still work being done because the basement, for instance, was not finished and still had a dirt floor. Now, the day the fire began in October, Van Asselt ran to his office, grabbed plans and documents and anything he could carry. He buried them in the dirt basement of the Palmer House and covered it over with some dirt. After the fire, he returned to the Palmer House site, which looked like that then, discovered that not only did the records survive, but that the clay in the soil had been baked into a hard crust that they had to chisel through to recover his records. So Van Asselt started the prevalent post-fire use of terracotta for fireproof building construction. Terracotta literally being the Italian word for baked earth. After the fire, the city passed an ordinance stating that all new structures in the burn district had to be of fireproof construction. Otherwise, the designs were mainly a visual replacement for the buildings that had burned down, using those saved plans from Van Asselt, for one thing. And one of Van Asselt's surviving post-fire buildings is this one. This is the Page Brothers building. And it was built in 1873, and it still stands at the southeast corner of Lake and State Streets. As you can see, it's right next to the Chicago Theatre. You see the bit of the marquee of the Chicago Theatre there. As larger buildings were proposed for the growing city after the fire, architects and engineers continued to have problems with building settlement, due not only to the high water table, but also poor soil composition. And I learned a lot about the soil conditions under Chicago in this University of Illinois bulletin, The History of Building Foundations in Chicago. It was written in 1948 by Ralph Peck. And in that bulletin, there is this core sample of the different layers of soil beneath the surface in Chicago. And so core samples taken in different places revealed many layers of material between the surface and the bedrock, which throughout most of the loop area is 80 feet below the river and lake level. So this was way out of reach of the technology available to the engineers in the years after the fire. The top layer, due to that grade raising we discussed, was a mix of miscellaneous fill. And just below that was a layer of gray lake bottom silt. It was noted to be of variable quality, but generally loose and compressible. It was the material that turned to mud in the spring and led to shifting foundations and settling. Now, according to Peck's bulletin, this next layer is quoting, a crust of partially oxidized blue and yellow clay, which acquired its stiffness by desiccation during a temporary low water stage of the geological forerunner of Lake Michigan. Although the strength and thickness of the crust varies, it is one of the most important features of Chicago's subsoil because it is the only material of high quality at a shallow depth. So most of the early skyscrapers we're going to discuss in a minute were founded on this crust, and it helped to spread the loads of the footings of those buildings. Now, the clay deposits beneath that oxidized crust were areas of settlement, and it gets gradually stiffer as the depth increases, and the thickness of each type is variable, although what you see here is a fairly accurate representation of most of the area downtown. And then at the very bottom, there is some sand and silt just above the bedrock. So this stuff was not the kind of thing you could anchor a building in for the most part until you get to the lower depths. If you broke through that crust by accident, or if you tried to do it on purpose, odds are your building was going to sink. So in the years after the fire, the city's architects and engineers were tasked with figuring out how to build on top of that dubious soil. Van Osdol was quite active, and like his peers, he was using his knowledge and skill and applied that to come up with new solutions through trial and error. Most of that trying led to successful structures, like the first post-fire City Hall, which was at the southeast corner of Adams and LaSalle Street. That's what I'm showing you on the right here. The C.H. McCormick Building at Lake Street, east of Wabash on the left, and the McCarthy Building, northeast corner of Dearborn and Washington in the center. But trial and error can also lead to the inevitable error. And unfortunately, Van Osdol was an associate architect on one of the more high-profile mistakes with this building, the Chicago Post Office and Customs House, built in 1879 on the west side of Dearborn between Adams and Jackson. And that's the site of the current Federal Plaza. You know where the Calder Flamingo statue is, that's where this thing stood. A Rand McNally guide to Chicago, published some years after this building was built, said this about it: there has always been an uneven settlement, destructive in character, and at times dangerous to occupants. To hold it together, heavy rods have been run through the upper walls. The solution that the builders tried with this building was an experiment with a mat foundation. It was common before this to place footings for a foundation a few inches above their desired level, and then allow the weight of the building to push them into the soil to a point of final settlement. The problem had always been uneven settlement, which led to buildings with walls that would sag or buckle. Now here, what they tried to do with their experiment was to pour a mat of concrete that, when hardened, connected all those footings into a single unit. It was thought this would spread the load on the entire site and force the building down to final settlement in a uniform way. Unfortunately, the mat just cracked under the strain and stresses. It's too bad that Van Osdol did not listen to his one-time draftsman and partner, Frederick Baumann, this gentleman. And what we see here is a building that Mr. Baumann designed that still stands. It's the Washington Block. It's at the southwest corner of Wells and Washington. He designed it in 1874, and during that same period, Baumann wrote a pamphlet that would influence the building and foundation for the next several decades, in which he described the method of isolated piers as followed in Chicago. In the pamphlet, Baumann illustrated the problem with those mat foundations or any attempt to structurally connect the piers being those vertical supporting wall sections or columns, trying to connect them before allowing them to settle. Any stress that would push a pier outward from due vertical would cause cracking and failures. So here's the front elevation of the Monadnock building. I'll use this as an example. And piers are the vertical supporting wall sections in between the ribbons of windows. So these arrows will show you where the piers of the building are located. That's where the load of the building is carried in a weight-bearing wall building. The piers are located along these horizontal lines, and spread foundations would be built on the site to support the piers. The key to keeping the post-fire tall building on an even, steady footing was to take advantage of that stiff crust and let the footing settle upon that. So taking a closer look at this upper section of the cross-section, in the first phase of construction of a new building, they would excavate the site, and then they would start building the spread footings for an isolated pier. The spread footing was called that because it spread out in a pyramid shape, and these were made of dimensioned stone, just big blocks of stone, each layer larger than the one above, all held together with a concrete mortar. Then it was necessary to place a load on the footing to mimic the force that would be exerted on the footing when the building was in place. So Frederick Baumann suggested loading the footing with pig iron. So here's some pig iron. And the pig iron was loaded onto the footing. And the fully loaded footing would then settle, in most cases settling onto the surface of that crust. The same process would be repeated for the other footings on the site until all had reached maximum settlement. Now, only once they'd all settled did they build the building. And so the footings were pre-settled. And once the footings were complete, the building would then be constructed on the isolated piers. And if everything went as planned, the building would remain on their even and sturdy footings going forward. Now, one problem with these bulky stone footings is they took up valuable space in the basements of the buildings. An example of that can be seen with the landmark auditorium building, opened in 1889, designed by Dankmere Adler, you see on the left, and Louis Sullivan on the right there. This is one of Chicago's true masterpiece landmark buildings. Now, here's a look at the basement level, where a large portion of the space is taken up by these spread stone footings. Now, as an aside, and as incredibly well as this building was planned and engineered, it was still dependent on the shallow crust for success. And it was found out the hard way that the crust was an inconsistent and sometimes unreliable ally. The heaviest portion of the building, the tower here, settled much more than expected. So if you've ever gone to a play at the at the Auditorium Theater, you might have noticed that when you leave the sidewalk, you have to step down into this area in between the doors, the little vestibule. And then when you go inside the theater lobby, you're now sloping up into the theater. And that's all because of the settlement of the tower more than the rest of the building. Now, another prominent influential architect was William W. Boynton, whose influence increased when one of his designs, the Chicago Water Tower, survived the fire. But he ran into trouble depending on the crust to be consistently supportive when his Board of Trade was built in 1885. Soon after this imposing structure opened for business, it was noted that the tower began to lean out from the true vertical, and it was leaning out over the sidewalk. So Boynton went to the site and determined that the lean was not structurally significant and didn't pose any risk. But the frightened public was not convinced, so the owners decided they had to surgically alter the building. In 1895, the tower was removed until the building was no longer that imposing presence at the base of LaSalle Street. It did survive until 1929, until replaced by the current Board of Trade. Now, most of the time, though, the principle of independent piers and the use of spread footings worked very well. But inadequate basement space still posed a problem, especially when they started building taller buildings. So it was a problem, though, awaiting an innovative solution. And that solution came when Daniel Burnham, who we see on the left here, and his first partner, John Root, on the right, got their first commission to design a tall commercial building in Chicago. It was the Montauk, which opened in 1882 on Monroe Street between Clark and Dearborn. The client was concerned that dimension stone footings would make it impossible to place the building mechanicals in the basement. The elevator machinery, the boilers for heat, and the dynamos for generating electricity all had to fit in that space. So it was John Root that had an inspired solution. Root noted that iron rails could carry the same load as dimension stone, but with much smaller dimensions, and thus much less space taken. And at this time, the railroads were transitioning from iron to steel rails, thanks to the Bessemer process bringing the price and availability of steel way down. So scrap iron rails were plentiful and inexpensive. So Root proposed that for the portions of the Montauk Foundation, they could use a grillage of scrap iron rails. We'll take a closer look at this detail here and see that, so there would be a layer of rails, and then the next higher layer would have the rails laid perpendicular to the one below. Then the spaces in between the rails could be filled in with concrete to keep the rails from rusting. So instead of these bulky stone footings, the grillage would take up much less space, leaving more room for machinery and equipment. So the first building to be supported on 100% rail grillage footings was Burnham and Root's Rookery, built in 1888 at the southeast corner of Adams and LaSalle. But the problems with spread foundations, whether of iron or steel grillage or pyramid stone, are that they took up too much space in the basement area and could not be built any deeper than that crust that they needed to be supported on. And the crust, while normally reliable, started to be proving more and more unreliable as buildings got taller. So the next concept they used to try to build heavier loads and use foundations to greater depths was the concept of driving piles. Now, when I first heard about driving piles, I have to admit that the image that they conjured in my mind was this. So if you're anywhere near my age, you might think driving piles means a pair of gomers behind the wheel of a truck. Actually, what piles are these. They're just long wooden stakes. And driving them, well, if you've ever done this with a hammer, you know what driving is, like driving a nail. So what they did was they took these long wooden stakes and they drove them into place by pounding them in. And they would set up a derrick like this, put the wooden stake vertically above where they wanted it to be pounded in. They'd raise a big heavy weight to the top of the derrick and slam it down on top of those stakes over and over and over again until they are pounded all the way down into the ground. So this type of pier construction was done by the railroads on the railroad bridges in the 1850s. And the railroads were building out all over the country and crossing rivers and streams everywhere. So they were getting quite adept at driving piles. For instance, for this bridge over the Mississippi River at Rock Island, happened to be the very first railroad bridge over the Mississippi River. And so, since the railroads had on their payroll civil engineers that were very familiar with timber pile methods, it's no wonder that two of the earliest tall structures in Chicago to use timber piles were these two railroad stations. The Grand Central Station, home to the B&O Railroad among others, was located at Harrison and Wells Streets. Its masonry tower is 236 feet tall. The rest of the building was 5 and 8 stories tall. The piles were 50 feet long and were each loaded to support 25 tons. And it was built in 1890. It stood all the way until 1970 and never had any signs of any settlement at all. Now, I came across this video showing a steam-powered pile driver in operation. Now, imagine the noise of 3 of those pounding hundreds and hundreds of times over the course of weeks as all the piles were driven at a construction site. And it was not unusual for the pounding of one pile to push another pile back up out of the ground several inches. It was like a gigantic game of whack-a-mole. So the Illinois Central Station was located south of Grant Park at Roosevelt Road. And in Ralph Peck's bulletin, he has a description of the IC's foundation, written by C.J. Mitchell, who was the engineer on the project. And Mitchell wrote that the piles were 40 to 60 feet long. There were 3 drivers, described as the usual pattern of drop hammer, with weights that were 2,800 to 3,800 pounds each. And the fall of the hammer was 35 to 40 feet. Now, this drawing from Peck's bulletin shows the cross-section of those pile footings at the IC station. And after driving the piles, the tops were sawed off 3 feet below the water line. And then concrete was filled in between the piles, and a 12 by 12 oak cap was placed on top across each row. Dimension stone was then placed on top of that timber. And so if we look at, I have a little artist rendition of what it might look like underneath the building surface here. We see that pile footings help to distribute the load deeper into the ground instead of relying on that stiff clay at the top. And so therefore, it meant that the taller buildings could be built without giving up needed basement space. Now, both of the railroad stations were south of the main business district and at a distance from most other structures. That can't be said of the Garrick Theatre building, which was built in 1892 and designed by Adler and Sullivan. And it was to be built right in the middle of existing structures. And after doing some core sampling at the site, it was determined that that shallow crust simply was not going to be supportive of a tall building. It just was not going to do it. So it was decided that they had to use timber pile footings here, all the way down to what was known as hardpan, which is stiff clay much deeper down, about 50 feet down. So here's a drawing of the from the 1893 Rand McNally's bird's eye view of Chicago. And the Garrick Theatre is mid-block, then known as the Garrick Theatre. Or excuse me, no, they're known as the Schiller Theatre. and it was in the middle of the block on Randolph Street between Clark and Dearborn. So before it was constructed, the site had to be cleared of its previous structure. And then the pile drivers were put in place, and they were given a sufficient number of blows to make sure that their points had penetrated that hard clay 50 feet down. The tops of the piles were then cut off 3 feet below the water line and were covered with a grillage of oak beams and concrete. Now, if you can imagine, all of this pounding was going on right around these existing buildings. And so while the use of the piles created a very successful foundation, the use of the pile driver caused damage to its neighbors. And there was litigation filed against the owners of the Garrick. From the get-go, they had to pay off damages because of this use of the pile driver. So the next major innovation in foundations again involved the building designed by Adler and Sullivan, and it was at the southwest corner of Washington LaSalle, the stock exchange. And the designs for this building were submitted for approval, like always, to the city. And when they were submitted, the owners of the building next door, the Herald Building, those owners obtained an injunction forbidding the use of pile drivers next to their building due to the inherent risk of damage. So to answer the challenge of how to build this building without rocking their neighbor, Adler and Sullivan turned to one of the unsung heroes of structural engineering, someone who truly deserves to be in the Engineering Hall of Fame, if there is one, General William Soy Smith. He studied at West Point, and he became a bridge engineer in the 1850s, then joined the Union Army during the Civil War. He later won an award for his work on the pneumatic pier foundations for the lighthouse at the Straits of Mackinac. Now, going back to our look at the layers of earth found under Chicago, the stiff clay crust just under the surface near the water level had been the usually satisfactory but sometimes unreliable support for the early shallow spread footings. Piles, on the other hand, were driven down to between 40 and 60 feet to make contact with another layer of hard gray clay known as hardpan. Soy Smith's idea was later dubbed Chicago Caissons. Now, that's a term he didn't use because it's actually a misuse of the word caisson. Caisson means basically a hole in the ground that is a chamber for working. So what he did here was he dug a well, and then that well would be filled with concrete to create a concrete pier. So what we now call a Chicago caisson is really just a concrete pier. But at some point after Smith started using this method, another engineer started referring to the pier itself as the caisson, when in fact the caisson's the hole, not the pier. But nonetheless, now, forever, whenever these are used, no matter where they are in the world, when people dig a hole and put concrete in it, they call it a Chicago caisson. Now, so Soy Smith decided that the way to get to the hardpan layer without pounding was to excavate a well, fill the well with concrete, and then the concrete pier could carry the load of the building. Now, the problem with this method, the difficulty, is that you dig a well, what happens? It fills up with water, especially when you're digging under the water level. So the water had to be continuously pumped out of the well as it was dug. Now, this same method, by the way, would continue to be used even for the newer buildings that had to go beyond the hardpan. Hardpan was fine for buildings of a certain weight, certain load bearing, but the taller buildings that we have now, they dig all the way to bedrock and put the pier there. So it's the same method, it just goes deeper. So rather than this, they would go all the way down to limestone, like that. Now, so as the well is dug, though, the walls of the well had to be carefully supported against enormous pressure. General Smith wrote about the procedure. In making the excavations, the sides of the well were supported by oak sheathing held in place by steel rings. And the sheathing was being put in place as fast as the excavation progressed. So these concrete foundations varied in diameter from 5 feet to 6 feet wide at the top and 6 feet to 8 feet at the bottom. Now, the settlement reached with the owners of the Herald Building, settlement of that litigation, allowed that concrete piers would be used adjacent to their building, but piles could be driven to support the rest of the stock exchange. So from Peck's Bulletin, We had this drawing showing the arrangement. The Herald building was the building next to the top side there. And so those round circles are the concrete piers that were dug. And all these dots are the piles that were driven on the rest of the site. So Soy Smith next went to work on the old Colony building at the southeast corner of Dearborn and Van Buren. This had been designed by Halliburton Roche, and it was 3 years later that there was already some severe uneven settlement due to its shallow spread foundations. And it was the south wall where the settlement was happening. So what Soy Smith did was he went underneath this building that was already there. Underneath an existing building, there's no way he could pound piles in. You'd have to tear the building down to do that. So he went ahead and used his concrete pier method. He underpinned the south wall with 4 concrete piers. So he would then write a bulletin at the time arguing that from now on, there should be no more shallow foundations. They're just not going to hold up in the long run. The extra money should be spent up front to either drive piles or if that's not feasible, dig your wells and put in the concrete piers, because it would end up being less expensive in the long run to do it from the get-go. Now, that idea took about a decade before it caught on with other builders. And William LeBaron Jenney, who we'll talk about a little bit more soon, he found the deep foundations unnecessary and a waste of money, he said, because as long as proper care was taken, shallow spread foundations were highly satisfactory. He said that Soy Smith's arguments in favor of deep foundations was above scientific criticism, but he said, quoting, "I am afraid it would be hard to persuade capitalists to pay the extra money to put them into practice. Nothing but an Eiffel Tower would demand them." Adler and Sullivan and Soy Smith used those deep foundations from then on, from 1892 all the way on. They never used a shallow foundation again. D.H. Burnham did not adopt them until 1896, Halliburton and Roche until 1897, and Jenney didn't start using them again until 1904. Now, Jenney would be very much praised for his work on this building. We'll talk about it again in a few minutes, the home insurance building. This was the very first true skyscraper to be built in Chicago. But he had to convince some capitalists that building it was the right idea. And this brings us to one of the main foundational principles of the Chicago School of Architecture. At the start of the tall commercial buildings in Chicago, architects were called on to figure out what such a building should look like. And at first, they followed precedent to create the forms, using styles they copied from elsewhere or learned from experience. For instance, W.W. Boyington relied on Gothic forms for his water tower. And he used Second Empire French styles in his hotels, including the Grand Pacific Hotel. But as Louis Sullivan grappled with the idea of what this new thing, this tall commercial building, should look like and how it should be put together, he started by rejecting the idea of precedent, and instead he said that form should ever follow function. Let the function of what your building has dictate the form. And he based function on 3 principles borrowed from the Roman architects: firmitas, utilitas, and venustas. And you can tell from my pronunciation that I did not take Latin in school. I have no idea how close I got to pronouncing that properly, but the translation is solid, useful, beautiful. So to convince those capitalists that were asking for tall buildings, the architects creating the new Chicago school style expressed how their ideas would help the usefulness, the utility of the structure to the final aim. So in a way, that's exactly what William LeBaron Jenney was doing, because the first function of the tall building was to increase the amount of rentable space that could be placed on a small lot in the confined space of Chicago's Loop. Land was expensive. It was some of the most expensive land in the whole country in our business district. So builders like Jenney told owners that a way to increase their return on investment was to build higher and make their office space within the building more desirable, so to be easier to fully rent out all the floors. Now, so in the home insurance building, what LeBaron Jenney had to convince the penny pinching capitalists to do was spend the money for Bessemer steel. Jenney wanted to use steel in the home insurance building that would allow him to create an internal skeleton of steel piers and spandrels that would carry the load of the building away from the walls. Since the walls would not have to carry as much weight and could be thinner, the building would be taller on the same footings as a shorter building with weight-bearing walls. And more floors meant more rentable space. Also, the walls that do not need to hold the building up meant the windows in the walls could be larger. Larger windows meant that more natural light could be brought into the structure, making the offices more desirable and perhaps worth a higher rent per square foot than other older buildings with darker interiors and smaller windows. So convincing the capitalists to spend money up front was something that LeBaron and Jenney was able to do here for this new breakthrough design. So Sullivan and basically all the other Chicago School architects soon adopted Jenney's extremely functional steel skeleton concept. Here, as construction is ongoing for this Schlesinger and Mayer store, which most of you, if you've been in Chicago for any number of years, you would know this building better by its later name, the State Street Carson Peary Scott store. And it's currently the downtown Target store at the southeast corner of Madison and State. So the skeleton of steel meant that the outer walls could function more as curtains rather than as structural members of the building. They would separate the interior from the elements while letting in light and air through openable windows. So well over 90% of the outer walls of the Carson Peary Scott store were windows. They were floor to ceiling, allowing a maximum amount of light in during an era when electric lighting was very inefficient and generated huge amounts of excess heat. Now, if you've ever had an easy bake oven, you understand that a light bulb gives off a lot of heat. So if you had to use nothing but incandescent lights to light up a building that didn't have windows, well, it would be an oven. So those windows, therefore, were very highly functional. Plus, the form of the building, its steel skeleton, can be easily discerned as being located in the areas around the windows. Those horizontal and vertical lines around the window openings, well, they express the form of the building's functional steel members. And if you look closely at the windows, those are what's known as Chicago windows. If that was one big openable window, that whole big opening was one big window on the bottom that you had to push open to get air, it would be way too heavy to be operable. So you put two smaller openable windows on the sides that you can open to get the air in. After all, there was no air conditioning. So you had to have outside air in. Again, you'd suffocate if you didn't. But you want that maximum light, so the big plate glass window in the middle does that. So this three-part design of windows, two open windows on the side, a big plate in the middle, that's a Chicago window. Now, it was Daniel Burnham, and here's the rookery that I was expecting earlier. It was Daniel Burnham that came up with the functional way to use the form of a building on a square lot to maximize rentable space on each floor. Now, again, office space to be rentable, it had to be able to take in outside light and air. Any room in the building that did not have access to both of those could not be used as workspace. They might be okay for closets, nothing else. So the rookery is the earliest building still standing that shows Burnham's concept of a central light and air shaft. So each floor has this design above the third floor and up. This is the central light and air shaft is sometimes referred to as a square donut system. Each floor of the building from the third up to the top had this setup. There is a corridor on each floor that makes an entire circuit. Offices on the outside had windows and openable sashes for light and air. They faced the street or the alley. Offices on the inside also had windows, but they faced into that central light and air shaft. So while the view on the inside might not be all that pleasing, the offices were at least functional due to this form. And that central light and air shaft also allowed for bright atrium lobby, since the glass ceiling with a few louvered panels is used above the second floor. And by the way, the name of this building, the Rookery, refers to its previous use. Before this building was built, the previous building had been the city hall, and it had a water tank on the top of the building that birds used to nest on. And so all these crows were on the top of this building and on this water tank, just kind of peering down everybody coming in and out of the city hall. So people started referring to the old city hall as the rookery, the place where the rooks or the crows hung out. So when they were going to build a new building on that same site, they decided to keep the name. And then they used that idea of birds in the atrium lobby they made the atrium lobby look like a bird cage for that reason, just as a little inside joke of architects. Anyway, Burnham's company was also one of the main companies that reverted to precedent in their repeated use of neoclassical motifs, such as columns. This is the Illinois Trust and Savings Bank. It was located at the northeast corner of LaSalle and Jackson. And like all other neoclassical buildings built around 1891, they had these columns, and they were not structural columns. They were just ornamental. Now, when Romans first started using columns back in the 3,000 years ago, they were very functional. They were what held buildings up. The walls were held up by the columns. Actually, the roof was attached to the columns as well. And they also allowed you a way for you to enter the building between the columns. But here, this building, like all buildings built after this time, has a steel skeleton holding the building up. The walls are just curtains. And so these columns do not serve any function at all other than satisfying an aesthetic. So Louis Sullivan despised neoclassical motifs and revivals for this very reason. But in terms of, Louis Sullivan didn't like these columns. He thought they violated his idea of functional forms. He's often quoted as saying that if we want our banks to look like Roman temples, then all the bankers should have to wear togas and speak Latin. But in terms of respect for the Roman builders, he thought a way to pay homage to them was to reference them symbolically in the form of the buildings themselves, letting the whole building reference a Roman column. So Roman columns, if you think about it, have three parts. They have a top, which is a capital. They have a long uniform section known as the shaft, and then they have a bottom base. So Louis Sullivan decided to make the entire building a reference to a Roman column. His buildings almost always had an overhanging cornice at top, a uniform section in the middle, like the columns, the shaft of a column, and then a very distinct base. Now in 1998, Spanish architect Ricardo Bofill was commissioned to build a new 35-story building in Chicago and Adams between Dearborn and State. His style was postmodernism, which is an architectural style that uses references to its surroundings in its design, as well as references to historic styles. So Bofill clearly knew his history. He knew the important history of the Chicago School of Architecture. So he created a design that echoes the tripartite form that was championed by Sullivan and his peers. The sleek new building has this base, shaft, and overhanging cornice, just as Sullivan would have designed. But Bofill also uses its very modern, functional mirrored glass. The mirrored glass helps reflect excess solar heating of the interior, which helps the building reduce its energy usage for air conditioning. Yet the mirrored glass also serves as a metaphor of respect, as the building literally reflects the images of the masterpieces of Chicago architecture that surround it. But there's much more, because as Bofill's building stands where it does on a place occupied by yet another masterpiece that was unfortunately torn down. In 1891, William LeBaron Jenney, designer of the world's first skyscraper, took on William B. Mundy as his partner, and they were commissioned to build a new store for the fair at State and Adams Streets. It was built in 4 sections from 1891 to 1896. And then Montgomery Ward acquired the fair in 1963, and this became their State Street location for the Ward's department stores. Now, it was unfortunately demolished in 1986, and that site remained a rubble-filled vacant lot for 12 years. So, when Bofill got his commission to build a 35-story building on that site, his engineers inspected the location, and under the rubble, they made an amazing discovery that not only was the Jenney and Mundy design foundation still intact, it was more than sufficient to support the load of the new building. So rising from the caissons of another era, Bofill's new building was unmistakably the product of the late 20th century, but it was literally and symbolically rising on the architectural foundations put in place by the old major, William LeBaron Jenney. So I hope you enjoyed our look at the foundations of Chicago architecture. I thank you for joining me. I just wanted to let you know that I do have a website, windycityroadwarrior.com. If you click on upcoming events, you can find out when I'm at places like today. And if you like to send me a message, you can do so at dave@windycityroadwarrior.com. And I would be happy to take any questions.
It's interesting, the tops of the buildings that you just recently mentioned, with how they replicate the columns of a Roman column. They always seem like a very distinct Chicago style to me.
Absolutely. That was the Chicago School of Architecture.
Got it.
And unfortunately, the overhanging cornices were made out of terracotta for the most part. And in all the freeze-thaw cycles and all the air pollution over the years, many of those started to have serious fractures and problems with them. So they became a hazard. Some parts of some cornices started falling on sidewalks. So many building owners, rather than repair them, just remove them. So there's a lot of classic Chicago buildings that look kind of odd because they don't have their cornice in place. And there are several that have gone through the trouble of repairing and replacing them. The Marquette is one that, the Marquette building's at the corner of Dearborn and Adams, just north of the Flamingo statue in the Fed Center. And what they did, though, when they restored that building, is they replaced, they got the original form, so they knew they were making them correctly. But they used a fiberglass material that was much lighter than terracotta and much better to standing up to freeze and thaw. And so that's what they replaced the cornice with on that building.
All right, Dave, thank you very much for coming and sharing your knowledge. And thank you to all the participants today for joining us. Maybe we'll see you next week then for scones, for baking scones. Thank
I'm hungry already.
All right, thank you.
Thanks. Have a good rest, folks. Stay well out there.
Okay, yeah.